Humans are fascinated by gore and violence, but even more so the mysterious and unsolved. This interest in disturbing and unpleasant subjects is called morbid curiosity, and it has gripped hundreds of people throughout the ages. I am one of those people. My name is Hallie, and this is the Morbid Curiosity Podcast.
In high school, I was assigned to read several books, many of which I would never have picked up on my own. One of these was Farewell to Manzanar, about a little girl and her family of Japanese descent and their life in an internment camp during World War II in America. It was one of the few books from English class that I really loved and still remember. This week's episode is about the Japanese internment camp featured in that book, Manzanar, and the people who were imprisoned there. On the morning of December 7th, 1941, the Imperial Japanese Navy made a surprise attack on the United States Naval Base at Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. It was the height of World War II in Europe, with Germany, Italy, and Japan making up what Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, called the axis of evil. But the United States had so far refused to join the war. The Empire of Japan hoped to keep it that way by attacking the harbor in order to keep the U.S. Pacific Fleet from interfering with its military actions. They also attacked several U.S.-held territories, such as the Philippines, Guam and Wake Island, northwest of Micronesia, and several British bases as well. This attack is well known for leading America to finally enter into World War II. What's not well known is the fear the attack spread amongst the American people. That fear found a focus in Japanese Americans. Due to a recession caused by the abrupt opening of Japan's economy to the world market, people began emigrating from Japan to the United States in 1868 in order to find work. Between 1869 and 1924, around 200,000 Japanese people settled in the islands of Hawaii, and around 180,000 settled on the west coast. As the Japanese American population grew, the European Americans began to fear competition over farmland and businesses. Hate groups like the Japanese Exclusion League and others such as the Native Sons of the Golden West organized a response to what they called the Yellow Peril, lobbying successfully to restrict property and citizenship rights of Japanese immigrants. Several laws and treaties were passed that attempted to slow immigration from Japan. Immigration was fully restricted with the Immigration Act of 1924. Because of this act, generational groups formed amongst the Japanese American community. The first group was called the Issei, and was made up of those people that had arrived before 1924. The Nisei were their American-born children, and therefore U.S. citizens. Because the new act prohibited Japanese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens, the Issei depended fully on their children to rent or purchase property. Despite legislation that tried to break up the Japanese immigrant population, the immigrants formed communities and contributed to California's agriculture and participated in charitable works where they could. As Imperial Japan rose in military power, the U.S. government started surveillance on Japanese American communities in Hawaii, fearing that spies and informants were among the immigrants. From 1936 until the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt and his government kept a list of people from the Japanese American community who would be the first to be put into concentration camps in the event of trouble. The use of the term concentration camp for these prison camps was discouraged in order to differentiate them from the Nazi death camps in Europe. The term concentration camp, however, means a place where large numbers of people, especially political prisoners or persecuted minorities, are deliberately imprisoned in small areas with inadequate facilities. These internment camps were the definition of this term. Despite the lack of evidence against any of the surveilled Japanese American communities, the U.S. government remained suspicious. The attack on Pearl Harbor was the eruption point of a slowly building volcano. Pushed by fear and panic more than any real security risk posed by Japanese Americans, President Franklin D. Roosevelt ordered the forced relocation and incarceration of more than 100,000 people of Japanese ancestry living on the Pacific coast. Executive Order 9066, issued on February 19, 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, allowed regional military commanders to designate exclusion zones and declared that all people of Japanese ancestry were to be excluded from the west coast of the United States. 62% of the people incarcerated were United States citizens. Around 80,000 were Nisei and Sansei, third-generation Japanese Americans. The rest were Issei. The Japanese Americans were suspected of disloyalty to the United States, even though the FBI concluded that there was no security threat, and the Justice Department stated that there was no probable cause for their incarceration. Evidence states that racial prejudice played a major part in the relocation and incarceration effort. One example of this evidence is a quote from Lieutenant John L. DeWitt, who was the head of the Western Command. He repeatedly told newspapers that a Jap's a Jap, and that it made no difference whether they were American citizens. They were still Japanese and therefore not to be trusted. Another example of this racism is that people with as little as 1/6 Japanese ethnicity were imprisoned in the camps. Some Japanese Americans voluntarily relocated. Some of the community leaders who had been on Roosevelt's watch list were arrested directly after the Pearl Harbor attack and were already in custody even before Executive Order 9066 was issued. But the majority of the nearly 130,000 Japanese Americans living on the West Coast were forcibly removed from their property and relocated in the spring of 1942. Before they were sent to permanent camps, many of the detainees were first sent to temporary civilian assembly centers, which were makeshift camps usually on racetracks or other disused land. There, the Japanese Americans waited for the more permanent camps to be finished before they were transferred to them. There were 17 of these temporary camps, and they were barely equipped to house the people sent there. The War Relocation Authority, or WRA, was responsible for relocation and incarceration. It was created by President Roosevelt on March 18, 1942. They managed the 11 permanent Japanese internment camps. These camps were Rower and Jerome in Arkansas, Topaz in Utah, Minidoka in Idaho, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Granada in Colorado, Poston and Gila Rover in Arizona, and Tule Lake and Manzanar in California. Manzanar, which is the best known of the internment camps and the first to be established, was and still is located in Inyo, California, which is in the lower half of the state near its western border. It opened its doors in 1942 along with the rest of the camps. Its position at the foot of the Sierra Nevada mountains, 230 miles north of LA, makes the terrain a desert, home to extreme temperatures. Long before Manzanar War Relocation Center was established, it was the home of several Native American tribes, such as the Owens Valley Paiute, the Miwok, the Mono, the Tuba-Tulabal, and the Shoshone, who lived in villages near the creeks in the area. The discovery of gold in the Inyo Mountains brought American and European American miners, farmers, and cattlemen to the area. This is where the area's history of relocation began. The Native Americans were forcibly marched 200 miles to Fort Tejon, an example of one of the many trails of tears. The town of Manzanar was officially established by ranchers and miners in 1910, but soon after they were also forced to abandon it due to the purchase of the area's water rights by the city of Los Angeles. Manzanar remained uninhabited until the U.S. Army leased 6,200 acres for the Manzanar War Relocation Center. Originally, it was a temporary reception center called the Owens Valley Reception Center. It was run by the U.S. Army's Wartime Civilian Control Administration from March to May of 1942. Before the WRA took over. The first Japanese Americans to arrive at Manzanar in June were volunteers who helped build the camp. By July, over 10,000 people were incarcerated there. The residential area of the camp was about 1 square mile and consisted of 36 hastily constructed tar paper barracks. Tar paper is a heavy paper coated in tar that is usually used for waterproofing buildings. Each family lived in a single 20 by 25 foot space, partitioned by more tar paper that didn't reach all the way to the ceiling. There was absolutely no privacy. This lack of privacy was worse in the latrines, where there were no partitions, and the showers, which were without stalls. For a very private culture, this was hard to adjust to. There were also long lines to use any of these facilities. Each block of barracks had a communal mess hall, laundry and ironing room, recreation hall, and a heating oil storage tank. There were also 34 blocks for staff housing and administration, 2 warehouses, a garage, a hospital, and 24 fire breaks. There were also school facilities, an auditorium, churches, a cemetery, a post office, a co-op, a few other shops, a camp newspaper, and other amenities that one would find in a normal city. There were also several industrial facilities and an orphanage that housed over 100 Japanese American orphans. Surrounding the camp was a barbed wire perimeter fence with 8 watchtowers manned by armed military police and sentries at every entrance. Food rations at Manzanar were based on U.S. military requirements for nutrition. Most meals were made up of rice and vegetables, as meat was scarce already due to war rationing. These meager staples were supplemented later in 1944 by a chicken ranch and a hog farm. These farms provided meat for all the incarcerees. As I mentioned before, the area in which Manzanar was located was a desert. Few people were accustomed to such terrific heat. The Owens Valley can reach temperatures of over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and nighttime winter temperatures of around 30 degrees Fahrenheit. High winds swept through the camp day and night, and the dust they carried with them was a constant problem. The dust was so bad that it was a daily experience to wake up coated in a layer of desert sand. The shelters and barracks were not equipped to deal with these conditions and were continually too hot, too cold, and always covered in dust. Most incarcerees worked at Manzanar, keeping the camp running. Unskilled laborers earned only $8 a month. That's $116 in 2016 dollar value. Semi-skilled workers made $12 a month. Skilled made $16, and professionals made a meager $19 a month. That's $276 in 2016 dollar value. All of the people incarcerated at Manzanar got a stipend of $3.60, the equivalent of $52 a month as a clothing allowance. While they lived at the camp, the loyalty of the prisoners was questioned. The Statement of United States Citizen of Japanese Ancestry was a questionnaire that was circulated in the camps in an attempt to determine the loyalty of the Nisei that were incarcerated. The questionnaire assessed Americanness, with questions such as, "Do you prefer baseball or martial arts?" The questionnaire also required a formal rejection of the Emperor of Japan, and a statement that one was willing to go to war for the USA. If these questionnaires weren't answered to the satisfaction of the WRA, the prisoners were moved to a maximum security camp at Tule Lake. Many were also repatriated to Japan. To make their incarceration livable, the prisoners of Manzanar set up many forms of recreation for themselves. There were sports teams for baseball, basketball, and martial arts. They tried to beautify their desert surroundings by building gardens with what water they could spare. They even created a 9-hole golf course, albeit without the manicured lawns that the game usually requires. Through these distractions, and in effort to prove they were loyal citizens of the United States, most of the prisoners accepted their new forced living situation. But not everyone. The way the camps were run went against many traditional Japanese ways of life, such as eating dinner with your own family every night, and the older generation serving as the head of the family. These traditions were upset by the communal meals and the fact that the younger generations were allowed to work while the elder was not. This disruption of cultural values caused dissatisfaction, which was expressed through civil disturbances over wage gaps, accusations of spying for the camp administration, black market dealings, and friction between the generations. These disturbances occurred at multiple camps. On December 5th and 6th of 1942, the most serious incident of resistance among all of the camps occurred at Manzanar. It later became known as the Manzanar riot. Several things attributed to this incident. For several months leading up to this event, friction had developed between two groups, the Japanese American Citizens League, or JACL, and the Kibei. The JACL, formed in 1929 out of several Nisei organizations in California and Washington, aided U.S. intelligence agencies in identifying suspicious and disloyal Issei. The Kibei, on the other hand, were Japanese Americans who had been born in the U.S., educated in Japan, and returned to the U.S. to find work. Their view was that America was home and that they should be treated as the citizens they were. The very different missions of these two groups made it difficult for them to get along, especially in such close quarters. The rumor that sugar and meat shortages were due to black marketing by the camp administration didn't help matters. A violent incident sparked the already fueled environment into flame. The JACL leader, Fred Tayama, was beaten by 6 masked men. Suspected of being involved, Harry Ueno, the leader of the Kitchen Workers Union, was arrested and removed from Manzanar. Between 3,000 and 4,000 prisoners gathered to protest Ueno's arrest. After negotiations with the camp administration, Ueno was returned to Manzanar, but kept in the camp jail. A crowd of several hundred continued to protest, and when they surged forward, the military police used tear gas to try and disperse them. Prisoners ran in all directions to escape the gas. In the chaos, several people pushed an empty truck toward the jail. This scared the police into action, and they fired into the crowd of unarmed prisoners. A 17-year-old boy was hit and died instantly. A 21-year-old man was shot in the abdomen and died several days later. 9 other protesters were wounded. 146 prisoners died at Manzanar, but only 15 were buried there. Of those 15, only 5 graves remain, as most were reburied elsewhere by their families. Today, the cemetery site is marked by a monument that was built by Ryozo Kado, one of the prisoners, in 1943. To this day, strings of origami often adorn the monument, as well as other mementos left by visitors. On December 18, 1944, the Supreme Court declared that loyal citizens of the United States, regardless of cultural descent, could not be detained without cause. On the same day, as part of the court case Korematsu v. United States, the Supreme Court upheld a conviction for violating the military order of exclusion. This ruling, in effect, stated that the removal of Japanese Americans was constitutional. Combined, the two rulings held that while the eviction of U.S. citizens was legal in the name of military necessity, the incarceration was not. This ruling paved the way for the release of the prisoners and the end of the camps. Though many pushed for an earlier end to the incarceration, the exclusion order was not rescinded until January 2, 1945. The WRA finally closed the camp on November 21, 1945. Manzanar was the 6th camp to be closed. While the prisoners had been transported to the camp by the U.S. government, transportation back to civilization was not provided. Many refused to leave because they had nowhere else to go, as their property and storefronts had been sold off or taken from them. These people were once again forcibly removed from the homes they had made in the camp. As the prisoners were released and began to leave, the WRA gave each person around $300, a one-way train ticket or bus fare, and for those with less than $7,900 to their name, meals for the journey. After the camp closed, the site was slowly dismantled. The structures were removed with the exception of the 2 sentry posts at the entrance, the cemetery monument, and the auditorium of the Manzanar High School, which was purchased by Inyo County and repurposed. Bits of foundation, sewer systems, and the remains of the landscaping done by the prisoners also remain at the site. Even after the closure of the camp, the journeys of the people incarcerated there were hard. They still faced sometimes violent racism and poverty as they tried to start over or go back to the lives they had left. They had lost property, jobs, health, and respect. The prisoners had grown depressed and were drowning in feelings of helplessness and insecurity. Many sought reparations for what had been done to them. Aiko Herzig Yoshinaga and her husband John extensively analyzed thousands of WRA documents and discovered evidence of perjure or willful deceit on the part of the U.S. government in several court cases that had challenged the constitutionality of the relocation and incarceration. The government falsified, destroyed, and withheld evidence in these cases to hide the fact that what they had done was unconstitutional. The evidence uncovered by Yoshinaga provided the legal basis needed for Japanese Americans to seek redress and reparations for their wartime imprisonment. The evidence also made it possible for the National Coalition for Japanese American Redress, the NCJAR, to file a class action lawsuit against the U.S. government on behalf of all those incarcerated in the camps. However, the Supreme Court ruled against the NCJAR. In 1948, Congress passed the American Japanese Claims Act, allowing Japanese Americans to apply for compensation for property losses that occurred during evacuation. Sadly, by the time the act was passed, the IRS had already destroyed most of the prisoners' tax records from the years of the relocation. This made it difficult for people to establish valid claims of loss. Of the 148 million requests, only $37 million was dispersed. In the 1960s, a younger generation of Japanese Americans was inspired by the civil rights movement to start their own redress movement. The goal was to obtain an official apology and reparations from the federal government for the incarceration. They focused not on the legality of the camps, but on the broad injustice and mental suffering caused by the relocation and incarceration. Their efforts granted them a small success in 1976 when President Gerald Ford admitted that the internment was wrong and was a mistake that should never be repeated. From there, the JACL took up the cause and asked for 3 measures of redress from the government: $25,000 to each person that was detained, an apology from Congress that acknowledged publicly that the U.S. government had been wrong, and funds to set up an educational foundation for the children of the Japanese American families. They were partially successful. In 1980, Congress established a commission, which in turn released a report called Personal Justice Denied, which condemned the internment as unjust and motivated by racism rather than factual military necessity. It also recommended $20,000 be paid in reparation to the former prisoners. In 1988, President Reagan signed an act that provided the $20,000 to former prisoners. The distribution of the funds, however, was racked with contentious debate. In 1992, another act appropriated an additional $40 million to ensure that all remaining former prisoners received the $20,000 that was owed to them. This act was signed by President George H. Bush and was followed by another formal apology on the 50th anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. Though reparations were made, nothing can make up for the years of heartache, racism, poor health, and helplessness experienced by the prisoners of Manzanar and the other camps. Today, Manzanar is a National Historic Landmark, a National Historic Site, and a national park. The Interpretive Center in the restored Manzanar High School auditorium houses a permanent exhibit that tells the stories of the prisoners of the camp and the people that lived in the area before the camp was set up. Guided tours, a replica of the camp guard tower, and educational programs are all available to visitors and share the common theme that the exhibits are important because they show the world that there is strength in making amends for the wrongs that were committed there. There were protests against Manzanar being made into a historic site. Many people objected to the term concentration camp being used in the historical markers and proclaimed that saying Manzanar was a concentration camp was treasonous. As I mentioned before, the term concentration camp is correct for this type of internment camp, but because the term has been associated with Nazi death camps, its use for Manzanar and the other camps is considered controversial. Still, the site of the camp remains a historic site, a place where what happened there can be remembered. Hundreds of books that tell the story of Japanese internment have been published, but one of the most well-known is Farewell to Manzanar by Gian Wakatsuki Houston, who was incarcerated at Manzanar as a child. Another well-known novel that contains many scenes relating to Japanese-American incarceration at Manzanar is Snow Falling on Cedars by David Guterson. A film about the forced relocation and imprisonment of a Japanese-American family from Los Angeles at Manzanar is Come See the Paradise. Another film, The Karate Kid, contains pivotal scenes in which the character Mr. Miyagi describes how his wife and newborn son died at Manzanar while he was fighting for the United States in World War II. If you want to learn more about Manzanar and the other Japanese internment camps, there are hundreds of books out there. This episode has barely scratched the surface, and there is so much more to the story than I can cover in a half hour, so I fully endorse reading up on it if you're interested. I recommend searching the National Japanese American Historical Society website or the Manzanar National Historic Site website. I also recommend the books Farewell to Manzanar, Manzanar by Ansel Adams, Remembering Manzanar by Michael L. Cooper, Silver Lake Dust by Kimmy Cunningham, and Manzanar by Jane Wherry. The Morbid Curiosity podcast was produced by H. Lloyd. If you'd like to get in touch or suggest a morbid topic for me to talk about, you can find us on Twitter at Morbid Podcast and on Facebook and Instagram at Morbid Curiosity Podcast. If you like the show, please share us on social media and give us a rating on iTunes. Your shares and ratings help us build a bigger audience and a bigger community. If you'd like another way to support the show, you can head over to our Spreadshirt store, which is located at shop.spreadshirt.com/Morbid Curiosity Podcast. There you can find t-shirts, stickers, and buttons with the Morbid Curiosity Podcast logo on them. Your support means a lot to us. My name is Hallie, and until next time, thank you for listening.